Okay, so this video is primarily going to be talking about Sanji, one of the main characters in One Piece. We are finally here at one of the most important videos in my entire lineup so far. I'm saying that because Sanji is a character that definitely connects back to so many different elements in the show and basically every video I've made to date. That being said, most of the video will use information that's already been shown in the anime or talked about in my previous videos, but there are a few details that will be mentioned briefly that are sourced from the most recent chapters going up to the most recent Sanji chapter 1034. I'll put spoiler tags to skip certain sections and the video should still make sense for those who aren't caught up, but like I've been saying, this is a time to be caught up if you aren't caught up to the manga. But okay, Sanji is one of the main characters in One Piece, considered by many as the third strongest on the Straw Hat crew, or equal to or in some perspectives stronger than Zoro. The stereotypes I hear about Sanji often is that he's either a wimp or a simp because of his running gag trait and how he treats women and approaches women, which to some can take away from his seriousness as a character, and for others even straight out dismiss him as a character deserving of a leadership position or Conquerors Haki. To others, it could just be seen as annoying, and it can sometimes be overdone. I think that, like I demonstrated in my Usopp video, Sanji is a character with a profound amount of detail and effort incorporated into all aspects of his design that have provided us with incredible plot points and clues for what Sanji will end up becoming by the end of the series. The way I view the world is by making connections, so let me connect you to my vision, the ParVision. So just reinforcing the amount of detail that Sanji probably has, fun fact, we know Sanji was a cook pretty much raised in the floating restaurant Bratier. This is actually the name of a restaurant that Oda worked part-time at before becoming a manga artist. In terms of connections, there's so many places where we can start from when talking about Sanji. We could start from his family, his eyebrows, his powers, his behavior, his various representations. Also, I'm going to say something ridiculous and it's kind of clickbait, but Sanji has the strongest move we've seen in the Straw Hats. Yes, stronger than Luffy and Zoro relative to when we saw them at the time of this move. You're actually going to be so mad when I finally say what it is, but Sanji is also high-key one of the smartest and strongest characters in the show. Amongst things I want to talk about in the video, I will definitely be talking about the number 3 every once in a while, and I'm definitely going to have to make extensions to this video. There's honestly so many things to talk about, but I think one of the main things for Sanji that connects everything is emotions and his name. Hold that thought. His name? Yes, his name. No, not that one. This one. Yes, if you didn't already know this, Vinsmoke Sanji's original first name was going to be Naruto. And I'm not sure if he was named Naruto, if Oda would have kept Vinsmoke as the last name, but Oda changed it to avoid confusion and give respect towards Kishimoto's Naruto franchise. That being said, I wanted to start here because yes, I do think Sanji's name carries importance. But the name Naruto must be some sort of indication as to some core concept with Sanji. It's also interesting because originally Sanji's design had him have 2 guns, and personally I think that would have been really cool and interesting in the context of the Vinsmoke family. But okay, what clue can the name Naruto give us? Believe it or not, it might relate to his eyebrows. So we associate the name Naruto Uzumaki with this symbol, which already reminds us of Sanji's eyebrows. Uzumaki means spiral or whirlpool, but Naruto can also be a reference to Naruto Maki, which are fish cake slices usually put in ramen that looks like this, with the spiral. And we know that Sanji loves seafood, and that's the connection. Yep, that's everything. Nah, I'm joking. So these fish cakes were actually meant to resemble the Naruto whirlpools in Japan, and I think that's the actual inspiration for why Naruto would have been a relevant name for Sanji. This is a visual representation of the currents in the Naruto Strait that create the Naruto whirlpools in between Naruto and Awaji Island, with the Naruto Bridge spanning the distance between them. You can already see why I think this is probably the actual inspiration for Sanji and the Vinsmoke eyebrows. In terms of swirls, there's not too many examples that I can think of that are 2 stagnant swirl designs besides yin and yang, but this seems like the actual inspiration. And before I get into Sanji, there's a lot to unpack here. So if I haven't already emphasized this, this video will be way better understood if you watch all the videos that led up to here. I would highly recommend viewing all my previous videos, but so a lot of my videos are trying to gain an understanding of the origin of devil fruits and connecting really interesting concepts of Haki and comparing them to devil fruit powers, while presenting the idea that non-devil fruit powers and peak Haki are possible sources for future devil fruit creations. Also, the overall concept that I was trying to demonstrate was that it seems like devil fruits, rather than containing actual devils, contain forbidden knowledge. This is supported by the interesting way things are named gods, demons, devils, and curses throughout One Piece, which might support the idea that devil fruits were named through some misinformation provided by the world government, who had the power to rewrite history as they saw fit after the Void Century. But so far, it feels rather than some sort of devil actually possessing the fruit, it's more so that the devil fruit provides knowledge rather than an ability. It provides the consumer with peak knowledge about its relevant ability and gives the user mastery over whatever ability they received. If that's confusing to you, watch my most recent video on pre-devil fruit powers shown in One Piece. I'm thinking about naming this group of people devil seed users, since they might be the seeds for future fruits. There's even more reasons connecting back to my old Vegapunk video. It makes sense that the smartest and most knowledgeable characters in the world are dabbling in recreating devil fruits, and one that has actually harnessed devil fruit powers and manipulated them is Vegapunk. A main reason I think devil fruits pass on knowledge is because of this connection. Besides the D-Clan, who was another group of people that was demonized by the world government? Ohara. And what were Ohara researchers demonized for? Their knowledge or potential knowledge. So if the researchers were the devils in this analogy, then their knowledge was the fruit. And how fitting was it that they were situated in a tree? So there's a lot I want to talk about and expand on with devil fruits regarding why they may look the way they do, their origins, their purpose, and so much more. But I'll get to that in another video. So why am I even talking about this in a Sanji video? Well, yes, the obvious is Sanji and the Vinsmoke eyebrows, but it was specifically this SBS answer that Oda gave in chapter 436 to the question, do all devil fruits have this swirly pattern on them? And Oda responded, yes, they do. That's one of their features, it seems. There are times that I think that Sanji himself is a devil fruit. It's not a secret that the fruits share the same swirly design as Sanji's eyebrows. So now circling back to the whirlpool references using Naruto, so the Naruto whirlpools I think reference energy, flow, and control. For these whirlpools to form, the main current provides primary energy and smaller periphery currents help create these major whirlpools. But also the whirlpools alter directions depending on the water levels of the northern current versus the southern current. Depending on the time of day and the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon, the currents will be altered. The sun and moon relevance will be discussed in a future video, but just wanting to note that Zoro has a lot of associations with the moon, and in recent chapters Luffy has been referenced to resemble a fire or sun god in Wano, so maybe Sanji represents the ebb and flow between them and grounds them by representing the earth, a planet that takes the offerings of both to create the endless potentials created by life in nature. Or maybe Sanji could also represent the sun as a primary source of energy, a point I'll elaborate on at the end of the video. But maybe the swirls on the devil fruit reference the flow of knowledge, a transfer and mixture of information being stored in an object. And also going back to Oda's comment of Sanji being a devil fruit, this is where some connections are made. So throwing out my theory part first, I've talked about how the monster trio seems to represent different aspects of power and energy, and they're all strong but in different ways. The one I spoke the most about in previous videos was Zoro and his ability to understand energy, and his actual need to understand energies to be a top swordsman, because he might be able to cut all kinds of energy as long as he can sense it. Luffy being a rubber man is someone who is able to resist energy and tolerate energy, whereas Sanji might be the member that can create flow, which is why in my elemental Haki video I labeled him the Avatar, master of all elements. All of this also might relate to another SBS Oda had in chapter 55 in regards to Sanji's eyebrows. Oda answered, all people owe their lives to circling. The sun and the moon and the earth all go around in circles. What if the circling of the earth suddenly stopped? The whole world would be deluged by gigantic waves and there would be a terrible disaster. So remember that Sanji's eyebrows have that kind of energy. I'll talk about this more later on and in a future video. I have a really exciting tinfoil hat theory that connects this stuff to Roger, and it's pretty cool. Before I go on though, I want to add one more side note that becomes relevant later on, but goes back to the Naruto whirlpools. This detail might relate back to Sanji's name, but like his actual name this time. Despite having to change his name to Sanji, I feel like maybe there's something else that could be learned here. So just based on the character G, I saw a similarity to Awaji Island, which is across the land of Naruto. Awaji translated means the road or path to Awa, so G in this context refers to road or path to, which is interesting in Sanji's context. And Awa has several meanings. These are the words that came in when translating this part. It was light, faint, pale. I think it could also refer to a rice field. I want to clarify I'm not an expert in Japanese. It'd be nice to have someone more familiar with Japanese language in my Discord. But we know Oda loves to use puns and multiple meanings when using words, and the one that made that fit something related to Sanji was light, so meaning the Naruto bridge leads to the path of light. And when I think of light, I usually lean towards knowledge, as something is enlightening or wondrous. I think this might be an interesting point for a few reasons that I'll discuss later on. So that being said, the other connection made here is that all the top scientists seemed obsessed with harnessing these various energies. Whether it's Chopper creating rumble balls that affect the wavelength of devil fruit energies, emphasis on the wave, which side note is Nami in Japanese. Again, we'll talk about in a future video. But not just Chopper, looking at Caesar who is attempting to recreate devil fruits through smiles, and then Vegapunk who recreated Kaido's fruit, but both of their fruits instead of having a spiral has a circle, and we know both have some sort of shortcoming compared to natural devil fruits, and this lack of spiral design might be a key aspect in that. In the smiles case, the zoans it produces seem to not be able to control the flow of the energy and are forced to have permanent animal changes rather than hybrid or optional transformations. We also see Vegapunk recreate Kizaru's lasers in the Pacifistas, for example. Who knows what other powers he may try to recreate through technology, but he has also been shown to have success in putting devil fruits into inanimate objects. If you put this into context of devil fruits giving knowledge, then that might be why inanimate objects have only been seen to consume Zoan fruits, because unlike Paramecia and Logia fruits, Zoan fruits are tied to providing knowledge about life forms. That life aspect is probably important, and so if you contrast what Judge has done with his kids, then you kind of see the opposite direction here. Noting that both Judge and Vegapunk were on the same MADS team, researching lineage factors. Under the possible duress of the world government, Vegapunk has pursued imbuing lineage factors into inanimate objects and recreating the fruits using lineage factors. Judge, on the other hand, went into copying with cloning and augmentation with his children. His augmentation led to where the kids have swirls on their eyebrows. We don't know if Judge has the swirl, but we know Sora, Sanji's mom, does not have the swirl, so we can kind of eliminate that it was hereditary. It makes more sense to me that the spirals were a result of the augmentations and the spirals indicating a connection to devil fruits. We know that Vegapunk was trying to put Zoan devil fruits into inanimate objects. What if the different route that Judge wanted to go was to put Paramecia and Logia type fruits into live objects? I'll talk about the Vinsmokes and more specifically Judge in a separate video, but that gives us a good enough base to focus back onto Sanji, talking more specifically about what makes him special. So Judge wanted to imbue certain traits. Queen noted them to be a human body with a strong exoskeleton, abnormal regeneration, physical strength, and a heart of ice. Judge specifically said by wielding the concentrated powers of advanced science, you are born to be greater than human. You will be unbound by the foolish, naive ways of the world, and then saying rule Germa with the ever-evolving power of science. The cost of these powers, which the amount of the price depends on the perspective apparently, but Judge gave these powers to his kids by some genetic surgery that sacrificed their emotions for these powers. Emotions being what Judge probably was referring to when he says foolish, naive ways of the world. Emotions is key, and is key to Sanji, and key to everything, even the devil fruit part we were talking about earlier. But let's talk about Sanji and emotions. This is honestly where the details start piling on and connecting back to the story and leading towards an understanding of why I'm even talking about any of this. So let's talk about some background on Sanji. Odas says that Sanji would be French in the real world. Like all the other Straw Hat characters, I think this is significant towards where we should look for clues for the character. Sanji is full of love for women and cooking to the point where some would consider it a distraction, mainly talking about Zoro here. Sanji's emotional aspect is highlighted even more when contrasted with Zoro. Zoro has been noted to throw away his earthly desires so that he could focus, so that there would be no distractions in his swordsmanship. He believes they are unnecessary, but still ultimately follows a similar path as Sanji, despite Sanji being the polar opposite. Instead of throwing away his emotions, Sanji immerses himself in them. He at times lets his emotions take control of him. I love this dichotomy because it really shows how two people who are polar opposites can end up on the same path and reach the same conclusions. This was extremely highlighted in Water 7 when Usopp was leaving the crew. We saw Sanji and Zoro come to the same conclusions despite normally being polar opposites in their mindset. This parallel is also a dichotomy of a state of depression and a state of anxiety. Zoro's depression has been noted through his alcoholism, which is a depressant, but also many people have noted that we rarely get to see Zoro even smile post time skip, whereas Sanji is the state of anxiety, and we really see the anxiety spiral during the Whole Cake Island arc. Sanji had to balance his crew's mission, his family's burden, human, his foster father's safety, his own happiness, and so many other elements, forcing Sanji to panic and isolate himself and make decisions that Luffy knew were wrong, and even his estranged sister. We also saw more of this anxiety in the most recent fights with Sanji and Wano, where Sanji was faced with the predicament of losing his emotions and went into a panic state and had to escape the situation to reassess himself. Losing his emotions was a severe trauma trigger for him because emotions are his core strength and what his father hated him for as a child. As a kid, Sanji simply wanted to pursue his passions and was beaten or bullied at every turn by his iced-hearted siblings. Sanji could have chosen to give up, but he persevered through so much to survive. Sanji's mom fought to give Sanji emotions, and Sanji suffered through so much being held together by the same thing that he was ostracized for, his heart. Sanji wasn't just a normal kid either. In my opinion, throughout One Piece, we see how inhumane royalty is and can be. Usually the average royal members or celestial dragons don't have the body to back it up, but because of the genetic modifications to also make the Vinsmoke superhuman, the brothers became inhuman in almost all senses of the word. Sanji, on the other hand, wasn't just a normal human physically, but he was the furthest thing from royal mentality, as he cared for animals and went as far as making food for rats, having Judge interrupt him and exclaim that royalty does not serve. Judge later in Whole Cake Island questions why Luffy even values Sanji, saying Sanji is the failure of Germa, his skin is not armor, he busies himself with menial cooking, he has no royal pride, he is swayed by emotions and exposes himself to danger for the sake of the weak, his mentality is soft, and he is flawed as a soldier. Luffy was extremely confused and questioned why Judge listed Sanji's best qualities as if they were bad. I think this juxtaposition of human values is actually highlighted by a famous French philosopher, René Descartes. So Judge's mentality on creating perfect humans was based on a more ancient philosophy, where it was believed that passions and emotions were distractions from making decisions, summarizing that passions were something that were more impulsive and something that needed to be controlled, whereas Descartes was one of the first philosophers to propose that passions were a vital mechanism in functioning as a human being. In his book, Passions of the Soul, he outlined that passions were actually what moves the soul, noting that the type of passion demonstrated could change your complexion's color, body temperature, and blood circulation. Descartes claimed that there were 6 basic passions: wonder, desire, love and hatred, and joy and sadness. All other emotions are derivatives and mixtures of these primary passions, according to Descartes. We literally see all of these in full force within Sanji. We see time and time again how Sanji's body literally moves due to his passions, regardless of what it is. We know that Sanji is most passionate about women and cooking, and will stop at nothing to complete whatever task or mission that is relevant to either subject. I think that one of the most interesting lines in the book that connects back to what I want to talk about in regards to Sanji is what Descartes claims to be a requisite for being a master of their passions. Descartes does not disagree that passions can sometimes be out of control, but it's not erasing them that allows for true evolution. It's more in line of taming the passions with your thoughts, which connects back really well to probably one of the most famous quotes, "I think, therefore I am." He says that an effective way of countering an undesirable passion is to imagine a new and different state of affairs, or response to the state of affairs. This process of reimagining your passions allows you to then shape the internal body to produce specific passions under the appropriate, rationally endorsed circumstances. Exercising control of the body means control of the internal motions of the body, such as the beating of the heart, circulation of the blood, and heat. All of this is literally the growth we saw in Sanji going in and coming out of Fishman Island. Sanji's passion for women put him out of commission, and through the mental training provided by Chopper and Sanji's control, he was able to prevent deathly nosebleeds. Once Sanji saw Shirahoshi, he reimagined his dream and fixed his brain. He no longer had the nosebleed problem, which ironically enough, the nosebleeds from stimulating situations in anime, specifically fan service situations, was a running gag that apparently stemmed from the idea that Japan had a high blood pressure problem, which resulted in nosebleeds. This method is what Descartes claims as a way to remedy and tame the passions, but the prerequisite for being a master of one's passion, according to Descartes, was generosity. Descartes says to be generous, one has to be experienced and knowledgeable about what is truly important for oneself. Generous people do good without self-interest, are courteous, gracious, and obliging, and live free from contempt, jealousy, envy, hatred, fear, and anger for others. If this doesn't sound like Sanji to you, it definitely will soon. The most standout proclamation of Sanji's kindness is when Reiju told Sanji that because of the way he was born, he was a human who had the most gentle and kindest soul. But even more than that, we see this concept in almost all aspects of his actions. The other key example is with Viola, where Viola used peeping mind to search Sanji's thoughts and only saw the vulgarity of his mind. In a woke world, that would be problematic, but if Sanji's thoughts were so blinding that Viola freaked out, and if that was the standard for Sanji's thoughts at any time he's seen a woman, and he's never harmed a woman, then we can say pretty strongly that Sanji is definitely someone who has tamed his passions, or at the minimum has control over himself. But even more so, in this moment, Sanji is acting extremely generously. He is acting without self-interest, knowing he could die behind enemy lines. He had no hatred for Viola, no fear or anger. You know what brought him there? Tears. I mentioned in previous videos that tears played an important role in One Piece. I actually want to make a separate video on just tears. But if you equate tears to sadness, then Descartes' notion that passions moves you is 100% supported by not just the love passions, but also the sadness passions. Sanji has this interesting quirk to be able to sense tears from a woman no matter how far. If they are suffering from some sort of traumatic experience, he cannot be stopped and his body rushes to save her, no matter who or what she is going through. And the craziest part is that Sanji wasn't the only person who demonstrated this passion-driven, action-based behavior. Odin also had this same quirk. This is actually how Odin discovered Toki. He was in the middle of a trial to join Whitebeard's crew, a trial so important to him the man let himself be dragged by a chain through an ocean for days. Odin wanted this so badly he had been trying to escape Wano for a majority of his life. But the moment he sensed a woman's shrieks, he abandoned everything to make sure Toki was safe, even though at the time he had no idea who she was, just that there was a woman in distress. I think this is important for so many reasons. The primary one being that we know Odin was one of the strongest in the verse, and particularly with Haki. He also demonstrated an unreal blind generosity, completely ignoring himself and dancing naked for 5 years for the sake of his people. In Wano, they called Haki Rio, which alludes to flow, and that is really important to the swirly idea, which we'll return to in a little bit. In terms of generosity though, Sanji also shared another similarity to Odin, but I'm only connecting it to Odin because of his respective position in the world in terms of willpower. This connection is cooking. Odin used cooking in an interesting way, and it served as a way he connected with people, even those who had passed away. In the first arc we learned about Sanji, we got a taste of his unyielding generosity when it comes to providing food. It stems from his hatred from wasted food, but also his personal experience having starved with Zeph while they were stranded. This created a formula where Sanji will serve anyone, ally or enemy, evil or good, poor or rich. It doesn't matter who they are because all people need to eat. Sanji will sacrifice his own desires when it comes to providing food. Just emphasizing this is still connected to emotions, Haki, everything we talked about. I actually think Sanji's cooking is his most powerful ability. But before moving on, I just want to circle back to one of the basic passions, wonder, because I think this one in particular relates to Sanji really well. Descartes explains the function of wonder like this: to learn and retain in our memory things of which we are previously ignorant. Wonder or admiration is defined as our response to something new without considering whether they are beneficial or harmful to us. I think Sanji really demonstrates this attention to new concepts and retains the memory of them. If you guys watched my observation Haki video, you may already see where I'm going with this point. One last really cool connection I want to make is that did you guys know that the word emotions actually originated in France? Before the word's introduction, feelings were described as passions or impulses or irrationalities. The etymology of the word emotions is really interesting. I mean, naturally you see the word emotions, kind of referring to the idea that they are feelings that move you or your soul. But what's even crazier is the word emotion comes from émouvoir, which means to stir up. What motion is stirring? Circular, creating a spiral. I guess Oda was right. All of life is circular. I have so much more that I want to talk about, and I'll bring up some points that won't nicely fit in this context, and there's a few things I'll save for another video. But now I want to start piecing some of these points together and really focusing on Sanji's future. So what powers will Sanji get? Well, let's get the easy ones out of the way first. I think that Sanji will become the ultimate master of observation Haki, primarily because of his sensitivity to his emotions. His ability to understand and empathize will allow him to create the strongest mind ropes or mantra or observation Haki possible. If you don't know what I mean by mind rope, watch my observation Haki video. Also, watch that video for the foundational possibilities that might be achievable through just pure observation haki. I think Sanji will be able to read minds like the insight fruit, hide his presence like the com fruit and the clear fruit, and the crazy part is, we've already seen that Sanji is able to, without his raid suit, be able to attain natural invisibility. And I know this point might be contested by a lot of people, and I have a few things to say on it, on the whole genetically modified human, cyborg, or haki aspects of Sanji's powers. But I'll talk about that later. I think it's not a coincidence that Sanji had very important interactions with some of the main proponents of observation haki based devil fruits that I highlighted in my previous video, from the clone fruit to the clear fruit, then his love interest in the insight fruit and memory fruit, and Sanji himself is basically the mark fruit in that he marks any woman who is in distress. The mark fruit works based off of memorization of a presence, and it seems to travel along the mind ropes towards a person, and it seems like Sanji has memorized the presence of a distressed woman and ends up doing the exact same thing. And another aspect of Sanji that I think is really important, and I think it's tied to observation haki, and it appears in all aspects of Sanji's character, which is memory. Sanji is extremely smart. I always thought this, but when we found out his father was one of the smartest characters in the verse, it just added up to me. Sanji is a character that probably has the most adaptable fighting style. Zoro also has an adaptable fighting style and learns swordsmanship as he goes along the way, but the amount of hardship that Zoro goes through to train and retain new techniques is kind of different than what we see with Sanji. I've highlighted this concept before, but I think Sanji is able to instantly copy any move that he experiences. We see this from the very beginning. His father figure Zeph was known as Red Leg Zeph, and Sanji adopted his initial fighting style and became known as Black Leg Sanji. Then the next time we saw a significant upgrade was when Sanji got his fire leg in Enies lobby. The interesting thing about it is I think it might have been foreshadowed in Drum Island arc. There was a specific scene where Sanji's leg was on fire, but the memory copy thing might have been when Sanji fought Wanze, and Wanze pulled out fire skate attack, which incorporated a flaming leg technique, and then he was able to copy it later in the same arc. Just a quick side note here, in Sanji's introduction chapters, it was subtle, but the importance of knowledge, especially for a pirate, was one of the biggest highlights during the Baratie arc. A majority of the reason Don Krieg was so hell-bent on taking over the ship was because he wanted Zeph's logbook of how Zeph was able to successfully navigate the Grand Line. Don Krieg believes that the only thing in his way from a successful voyage is knowledge, and the memories held within Zeph's logbook. Just highlighting that even since the beginning of Sanji's story, knowledge and memories were incredibly important. But getting back to how Sanji demonstrated this. Also, Sanji experienced Skywalk and was able to not just copy it, but also elevate it and create Blue Walk. Then there's Electro that Sanji experienced on Zoe, and then we saw him use a similar electric ability against Oven. Time and time again, Sanji is shown to be a sponge of some sort, like he experiences something one time and then he's able to recreate it. This is really important because in Wano, we are seeing this unleashed in regards to his raid suit. At first, it seemed like Sanji's raid suit abilities were limited to just stealth, similar to how his brother's abilities were limited to their own specialized attacks. But then we see something interesting. We see Queen recreate all the attacks, and this makes me think that Sanji will be exposed to the attacks and be able to recreate the attacks. He was exposed to the raid suit one time, and remember what I said in my previous video? Perospero referred to the raid suit as memory armor. It might be that for his brothers, the raid suit contains the memories that allow for the powers to manifest, but in Sanji himself is a memory human and is able to retain the memories internally, which might be the secret behind this scene where Sanji gets mangled up, but he's able to reform his body. It looked much different than simple healing or recovery. It almost looked like his body restored from a previous memory setting of his own body. Almost like that Rene Descartes quote, "I think, therefore I am." I know this sounds crazy, but it's almost like the clone fruit power of being able to remember and memorize presences. It's also interesting because that recovery ability that Sanji demonstrated was something we know his brothers aren't capable of. When Sanji beat Yonji's face in, Yonji needed the mechanic doctor guy to reset his face with a hammer. If his brothers, who are supposed to be peak evolution of humans, couldn't do it, why is Sanji able to do something like that? Can that really be tied to genetic modification or technology? I mean, the big question still unanswered is, what is the drug that Sora took to counter Sanji's transformation in the womb? And I have a few ideas that I'll share later on, but I think that there has to be something involved with memory and Haki. Speaking of Haki and memory, this is a great time to talk about Sanji's most powerful attack, the attack that I think can be considered one of the strongest on the Straw Hats crew. It was an attack that incapacitated a Yonko. It was Sanji's cooking. This man near took out a Yonko with his amazing cooking ability. Yes, it was a little clickbait, but it's true. Think about it. He chose not to poison or bomb the cake, which would have been the easier route. Whether or not Big Mom has immunity to poison, we don't know. But I feel like they could have ended the Yonko pretty easily that way. But Sanji refused to do so because of his strong principles. He was so convinced that his cake would be so amazing that she would literally die from happiness and that it would knock her out with his flavors. That sounds like Shokugeki no Soma, but let's be honest, Sanji has had this ability growing since the beginning, and it's a huge part of Sanji as he is the crew's cook. So let's back up a little bit and talk about Sanji's ability as a chef. One of the key things about Sanji is his insane memory when it comes to cooking. He is able to retain new techniques and incorporate it all into amazing dishes, and being able to use a wide variety of ingredients and having almost no limitations when it comes to that. No matter where he is able to whip up amazing dishes, and even we see before the time skip, he has a really solid medicinal level of understanding of food nutrition. That takes a profound amount of memory. There was a side story with Sanji where in the Alabasta banquet, Sanji demonstrated his ability to learn and perform new cooking techniques perfectly on his first try. He was also demonstrated to learn the 99 Nukama attack recipes fairly easily. This is an amazing ability which again we see get translated into his fighting style as he experiences an attack one time and then is able to copy the attack. But going back to the cooking part, there's a whole other side of it that I think should be talked about, which is that I think Sanji may be able to imbue his cooking with Haki. Not too different than the swordsmen that created cursed swords or the entities that created devil fruits. Imbuing a will or history onto an object. Sanji can literally create cooking that evokes emotions out of people. Honestly, his cooking is not too different than some of the devil seed users like Django and Miss Golden Week that I talked about in my previous video. What do I mean by that? Hypnotism. Sanji is able to hypnotize through his cooking, and this was actually specifically said when he had the mafia guy try his cake. It was noted that the flavors hypnotized the consumer, and the power was so strong that it even worked on Big Mom. Sanji is able to make people feel happiness through his food. That is a Conqueror-like ability, and also relates to observation Haki. It honestly ties to so many concepts, but being able to affect another's will through food is definitely something a Conqueror can do, and you may think this is nonsense and crazy, but this is the ultimate contrast to Judge. Judge was trying to raise conquerors and believed that if Sanji as a royal was cooking, an activity done by peasants because it was an act of service, he would be a stain on his reputation and could never become a conqueror. But the fact that Sanji is actually a conqueror and it's through his cooking, he is able to conquer literally anyone through his food. Enemy or stranger, they will feel what Sanji wants them to feel through his food. I think cooking will definitely be incorporated into Sanji's fighting or toolkit somehow in a larger part in the future. We see his cooking literally restore spirits like it did to Luffy in Whole Cake Island, and that's without the 99 attack recipes from Ivankov's kingdom, which those recipes seem like a stepping stone towards this concept. I think it all culminated in Sanji being able to imbue his food with his willpower. When you think of conquerors, you think of incapacitation, and as Rayleigh said, it's the ability to dominate or control another's will with your own will. Is Sanji not doing that with his food when he makes the women on Wano fall in love with his soba, or his entire crew satisfied with his foods, or various people cry like Big Mom? Just to encapsulate so many of the concepts that we just talked about, from Sanji's incredible generosity to his hypnotic-like cooking, believe it or not, this was all displayed at the very beginning when we were first introduced to Sanji. If you remember Sanji's incredible display of generosity and kindness with Jin, he saw Jin starving and could not refuse him service, given Sanji's backstory. Jin was incredibly grateful and said he had never tasted anything so delicious and that he didn't deserve this. Now later on in the story, we find out what kind of man Jin is. According to Don Krieg and his crew, Jin is a cool-headed, trusted demon man that will torture a man to death heedless of his screams and doesn't have an ounce of mercy. He was supposed to be Don Krieg's most loyal man and never refused his orders. But in the end, after Jin defeated Sanji, he could not bring himself to kill Sanji because Sanji's kind actions. Now yes, Sanji had a sob story and was nice to him, but this was a man that had a history of having no mercy. Someone just being nice to him is kind of a stretch to just change him. I mean, it didn't work on Don Krieg. It would make sense to me that Sanji's cooking is what was the catalyst to reform Jin to the point where Jin took out his own captain that he respected so much, and while doing it, thanked Sanji. The character change was so absurd that these are the exact words Don Krieg said. "It's inexcusable that you, my most trusted officer, should refuse to obey my order. What madness has possessed you?" I think it was Sanji's cooking and generosity that possessed Jin. I think this whole introduction to Sanji hinted at so many ways Sanji would fully develop, and I'll talk about some of the other things later on. One of the crazy parts about Sanji and cooking is that besides my reaction to chapter 1034 when we found out that Sanji's been putting a limiter on himself this whole time, beyond just that, Sanji's a character with multiple limiters that he put on himself. The one that connects to cooking is that he refuses to use his hands for fighting and will only use it for cooking. Something interesting that I've been thinking about recently is that Sanji's fire moves are making him literally sear and cook his opponents. I wonder if there's going to be a time when Sanji ends up using his hands for fighting, since he is technically cooking his enemies now, specifically knives and weapons. I think Sanji would be an insane weapons master, and this actually connects back later to an external connection for Sanji's character inspiration. But I'll get to that when I start talking about Sanji's fire abilities. But going back to Sanji using his hands to fight, we did actually see this before against Wanze since he was made of ramen. Now that I think about it, Sanji might pull this out again when he fights Big Mom's crew. Oh wow, yeah, now that I think about it, Sanji never really fought any of the food-based Devil Fruit characters, and so if Sanji ever fought them, he would be able to use his hands and actually demolish them. I think when people picture Sanji versus Katakuri, they forget that since Katakuri is made of mochi, that gives Sanji the clear to pull out his swordsmanship, because Sanji's technically a swordsman too, which again, I'll get back to later. But going back to the idea that Sanji has been imbuing Haki into his food, I think this is another instance coming back to the spiral idea. I think Sanji will become an empathy Haki man. Through his foods and his attacks, he will be able to make people feel emotions. I think all of this alluding to the idea that Sanji will, yes, get Conquerors and demonstrate peak Haki, and going to the next part that we kind of already talked about him being a master of energy conversion, which relates to armament Haki. I'll be making a video talking about armament Haki just like I did for observation Haki, so look out for that to elaborate on what I mean by this. There was another connection between cooking and fire that I want to highlight before moving on, and I feel like it's intuitive, but it was highlighted even further by this French lawyer, and I'm not going to act like I can pronounce it properly, but Jean-Brias Savarin, who wrote one of the most famous books about food called The Physiology of Taste. This is what he says in his book about the philosophical history of the kitchen. Cookery is the most ancient of arts, for Adam must have been born hungry, and the cries of the infant are only soothed by the mother's milk. Of all of the arts, it is the one which has rendered the greatest service in civil life. The necessities of the kitchen taught us the use of fire, by which man has subdued nature. Looking carefully at things, 3 kinds of cuisines may be discovered. The first has preserved its primitive name. The second analyzes and looks after the elements. It is called chemistry. The third is the cookery of separation and is called pharmacy. Though different objects, they are all united by the fact that they use fire. As we mentioned before, we have seen all 3 kinds of cooking demonstrated by Sanji, but even more so, the line that says cooking is the greatest service is very fitting for generous Sanji. But more than that, the kitchen taught us the use of fire, by which man has subdued nature. We know Sanji has a tolerance for fire and a familiarity in the early chapters. We catch Sanji saying, "You can't be a cook if you're afraid of fire." So naturally, the next thing I want to talk about after Sanji's cooking ability is his strongest ability now, and what I think is related to elemental Haki, the fire leg ability that Sanji has. Sanji himself has said that this ability stems from his soul and his passion. The thing about fire, as I highlighted in my elemental Haki video, is that it's not just Sanji and King that have demonstrated an aptitude for fire. We now have examples of normal users conjuring fire, then the peak of fire ability being the flame fruit that Sabo currently holds. But in between there's Lunarians who seem to expel heat as a form of energy conversion, then there's Doflamingo who is fire strings, there's Wanze with fire skates, and Luffy with red hawk. I already explained in a previous video that one of the precursors to manifesting fire seems to be an intimate experience with fire, and all the characters mentioned have a significant scene where they endure flames, and then Sanji being a cook is what gives them the familiarity with flames. And I think the specific note on Luffy and Sanji is that they may show us examples of how to manifest the flames. Let's start with Luffy. Luffy's ability with fire manifests specifically, at least non-canonly, the first time when Luffy refused to take any more Ace slander, and his memory and passion for Ace brought forth the ability the first time. We often see Luffy bringing out this ability when he is more emotional or angry. I think the most notable time for me is when he found out that Tama was hurt. Knowing Ace tried to protect her too created one of the most powerful Red Hawk abilities I've seen, at least besides in Wano. The connection here to Sanji is that Sanji also seems to have initially started out with this fire fire leg specifically when he is angry or full of hatred or remembering hell. He told Jabra, "Watch what you say. When I get angry, I tend to heat up." So even from the start, this heat was tied to his passions. Specifically, one of his notable fire attacks is called Hell Memories, which when you decipher the name of that move, it's him remembering hell and the trauma it brought him and manifesting it outwards. So when Sanji says his fire is brought on by passions and his soul, that is an immediate connection in my brain to the concepts that Descartes talked about. Descartes said certain passions could change even the temperature of your body. I think this reflects that the anger and hatred that Sanji feels allows him to convert his soul energy into fire, which I think is specific for Sanji, but it seems that fire is tied more to negative emotions relating back to pain. In King's case, the reality according to Queen was that King and his race experienced hell more than anyone else, which again ties back to accessing fire abilities. The other people who are more potent in random fire abilities like Zoro and Doflamingo also have experience with their own respective hells. But now tying this back to the elemental Haki theory, it might be that different emotions allows you to access different elements. So since I said Sanji is a character that represents peak emotions, then that could be why we see a plethora of elements coming from Sanji. Wind, for example, we know Sanji to have an affinity for air as he is able to skywalk, and even more than that, Diable Jambe in kanji translates to devil windfoot. So if we tied fire to Descartes' hatred, then wind might be desire, which is a future-oriented response to something perceived as good or as evil, and causes us to want to attain something good for us or want to avoid something bad for us. When we think about how Sanji learned to first skywalk, it was stemmed at his desire to escape and avoid conflicting with the newcomer. He did not want to be turned into a woman by wearing the dress, so he desired so hard, and his future-oriented response there was to start controlling air, which again, if you connect back to the swordsmen like Zoro who command air slashes, they are full of desires. Their literal attacks are their wills being projected, desiring for what they are targeting to be cut. And if you guys remember my example as the possible biggest example of wind powers in One Piece, Dragon, Sabo, and the Revolutionary Army. This might mean that Dragon's desire for something is huge to be able to command the wind the way he does. This is mainly if I'm correct and Dragon doesn't possess a wind-related devil fruit, which I can explain in details again in a different video. But anyways, then we go to the passion of sadness, and I think this passion connects to water, and we know that Sanji has at least some affinity for water since he's able to blue walk. I think Sanji might learn Fishman Karate as well, and literally become an all-terrain god. And for those that think that these abilities are enabled by the fact that Sanji has a genetically modified body, well, there was an example where on Punk Hazard, Sanji was able to demonstrate blue walk while in Nami's body, which was noted to cause immense strain on her body. But the important note here is that I think this indicates that this ability isn't enabled by either Nami or Sanji's body. Sanji wasn't in his body, and it's not like Nami should be anywhere near strong enough to use this martial art, so it has to be some sort of manifestation of willpower. Also beyond that, we already noted that Sanji can sense tears, which I think relates to sadness and the overall water power. When we go back to Descartes' idea of sadness, is that it's our response to the thought of a present evil or defect within ourselves, and causes us to feel a sense of listlessness, discomfort, pain, stemming from the feeling that we possess the defect or evil. Then when you think of the race that is most associated with water control, it's the fishmen. Their entire race is ostracized and isolated because they are labeled as savages. Jinbei is a character who is so forgiving and honorable and puts the burdens on himself. It might be that they have an innate understanding of sadness more so than others given their macro situation. An example is when Otahime was able to force mass crime because everyone was sad about the thieves' unfortunate predicament, and ultimately the shared sadness brought them together. Fisher Tiger was noted to be one of the most prominent fishmen, and this was the line that directly connects Descartes' perspective on sadness, when Fisher Tiger says, "The thing I fear the most is the demon inside me." This innate feeling that they were the evil, that they were the defect, is something that the world had told fishmen and merfolk for as long as we have known. This sense of sadness tying into Fishman Karate and tears goes even deeper when we look at the people who we know who are not fishmen that have learned Fishman Karate. Let's talk about the first one, Koala. Well, first, I think there's a larger grouping here, and that is slavery, that we'll connect back to in a second. But Koala was a celestial dragon slave that experienced true terror for what we can assume to be nearly 11 years or her whole life. She was so traumatized that she had to lock up her emotions to be able to tolerate her life as a slave. In no circumstance was she allowed to cry, and she was conditioned to lock it up. It wasn't until Fisher Tiger confronted her and showed her that they were not a threat and that she could cry and to let her emotions flow. She then burst into tears. The other person that I want to tie this concept to is Robin, because she is a non-fishman who has learned and shown fishman karate. In a lot of ways, Robin demonstrates a lot of the same connections as Koala and the inhibition of her emotions for survival. Robin had her own significant moment of tears where she finally allowed her tears to flow and her emotions to be let loose, and it was Luffy who opened those gates. The concept of emotions flowing is really important here. A lot of the characters mentioned, Sanji, Koala, Robin, all have had ties to some form of slavery or oppression. They were in situations where they had to suppress their emotions, or they were incentivized to suppress their emotions for survival. Each one of them experienced versions of hell, and because of the emotional suppression and then the ability to then express the emotions might allude to their understanding of being able to create energy flow, which again ties back to Descartes' concept of how passions move the soul. As a side note, this line of thinking gave me a very interesting thought about the slaves in One Piece and the legend of the sun god Nika, and just the representation of the sun. It's interesting because based on all the things I've said, it sounds like all slaves would be able to manipulate water because of their experience with sadness and oppression, and maybe that's why all fishermen even generationally are able to manipulate water. But the other thing that slaves probably share in sentiment is deep hatred and resentment, which would be the passion that controls fire. So maybe the sun god was someone who rallied and enraged the slaves and allowed them to burn Mary Joie down and released all the slaves at the same time. Maybe those slaves had such deep hatred that they became fire and actually didn't survive because, as we know, Sanji through his hottest fire has to temper it or else he risks burning himself. So if the slaves unleashed their emotions to the full extent, they might have just burnt themselves, which is why the sun god was purely a legend that no one really knew about. Which brings us to another part of the fire control, which I think is interesting: heat tolerance. In recent chapters, we learn that Sanji actually has to tolerate the heat of his fire, and because of his Haki and now exoskeleton, he is able to burn his fire abilities even hotter than ever before. I talked about this in a chapter reaction video about how this concept is fairly new, where armament Haki has now been confirmed to provide heat tolerance. This is something that yet again connects Sanji to Oden, because Oden displayed an insane level of heat tolerance as he was able to endure being boiled in oil for an hour straight. There was no display of armament Haki, and we know that Oden isn't a modified human, but he was able to endure such a heat. Does that mean that Oden used some other form of Haki to tolerate that heat? To me, it sounds like Oden had elemental Haki mastery over fire, and as we have been alluding to throughout the entire video, Oden and Sanji probably had mastery over the passions and were able to wield fire proficiently. That's why even Kaido's Boro Breath had no effect on Oden. This could also be why Luffy was shown to be immune to Kaido's Boro Breath along with the innate properties of rubber. But there's actually another character that I want to bring up that showed heat tolerance, and this character was also enslaved, meaning they experienced a hell and shared a connection to the topics discussed previously: Boa Marigold, Hancock's sister. In chapter 520, we see Boa Marigold actually light herself on fire, but also maintain that fire and not suffer any burn damage. I always thought this was interesting because it doesn't seem at all related to her devil fruit, but instead it's probably related to armament Haki here. It seems like she uses a match to encourage the fire, but then is able to then expand it and maintain it, which alludes to some sort of fire manipulation. But the tolerance to heat here was probably armament Haki, which we wouldn't have seen at the time because it was pre-time skip, but also the island was known to be proficient in armament Haki, and the Boa sisters probably had peak levels of armament Haki. I also want to note something that I see a recurring trend with. It seems like each person the Straw Hats have fought, especially in the pre-time skip, may be indicative of what their end of series output will be. I think specifically the first opponent for each Straw Hat might be significant. For example, I tied Usopp to Django's ability of word manifestation. Sanji also has the same thing actually. His first opponent was not Jin. It was actually Pearl. If you don't remember, it was this guy who was reported to be an invincible iron wall. He was reported to not lose a single drop of blood in battle and come out of his fights without any cuts, and specifically fought by protecting his whole body. I don't know about you, but that sounds kind of exactly what we're seeing out of Sanji right now. His exoskeleton is the invincible iron wall, and then he also couldn't be cut by Queen. Time and time again, Sanji props himself up to be the shield for the Straw Hat crew, whereas Zoro is the sword. But then it goes a step further because this shield guy also lights himself on fire with a blue flame. That doesn't damage him, and the flame comes out and is maintained when the Pearl guy freaks out because he is in danger. It's almost like he hates being hurt because it reminds him of his childhood trauma of being in a jungle. But anyways, Sanji's first opponent was an invincible iron wall shield guy who lights on fire and uses flame attacks. Well played, Oda. Sanji essentially became exactly that. But anyways, the concepts of fire and flames is so embedded into One Piece. Even Roger's execution. Rayleigh said that Roger sparked a wildfire that spread throughout the world, and Whitebeard said bloodlines and wills were like flames that continued to be passed on without being able to be fully extinguished. I wonder if the sun god was someone who had control of that kind of metaphorical flame and was able to set ablaze the fire within people. But speaking of gods, it's probably a good time to bring in some connections that I think helped inspire Sanji's character. There were several connections that can be made that can help us figure out what we can expect out of the endgame Sanji. So first, because I connected Zoro to the Byakuya, there was another beast that in so many ways connected to Sanji in the same mythological reference, and that was the Black Tortoise, or Genbu, which protected the north, and interestingly, Sanji is from the North Blue. An interesting fact is that in China, the word tortoise is the term of abuse, so instead the name Black Warrior was given to the representatives of the Genbu, which has a connection to black-legged Sanji and his black-clad appearance. This celestial emblem represents longevity and wisdom, and its shell is the vault of the universe. With Sanji, I made a bunch of connections to his ability to memorize and be incredibly smart and wise, but also his raid suit / exoskeleton was referred to as a memory armor by Perospero. So is that a connection to the vault of the universe? Also, the tortoise element is water, which gets interesting with a different connection later, but also the ideas of emotions that I talked about earlier with Sanji. The other thing about the tortoise is that after becoming 1,000 years old, the tortoise is able to foretell the future, which connects to Sanji's future sight. Also, randomly, Sanji as a kid was shown with a turtle, and there's something interesting about that I'll try to put in at the end of the video. So it's crazy because the black tortoise already sounds like it represents Sanji so much, but there's an interesting detail that was in a classic novel, that this black tortoise was usually symbolized alongside a snake that was attached at the hip, and commonly the tortoise represented women and the snake was representative of men, which I thought was an interesting concept. But moving on, there was a classic novel that depicted Jean Wu, who was supposed to be the Black Warrior, so he was told that in order to achieve god status, he must purge all humanly flesh from his body, and that because he indulged in human foods, that made him more human-like. That sounds a lot like Sanji's backstory. So what happened for him to achieve god status? A god performed surgery on him to replace his stomach and intestines, which were human, and the stomach became the turtle and the intestine became the snake. Turtles representing armor and protection and wisdom, and the snake representing flexibility and longevity. That sounds again a lot like what Judge did to his kids, performed surgery to give them armor and flexibility. I just thought that was interesting, but what I really want to talk about is the Buddhist counterpart for the Black Warrior, Tamonten. We know that Oda loves to incorporate Buddhist references, known as Tamonten and also Bishamonten, one of the 7 Japanese gods of luck, which I'll come back to in a future video. But Tamonten was someone who is all-knowing, one who hears everything in the kingdom, and one who is always listening. Does that not sound like an entity who has peak observation haki? That is literally everything we associate observation haki to, and all concepts I showed observation haki to demonstrate throughout my videos. The Tamonten is often depicted as yellow, as bright as 1,000 suns, and in his right hand he holds an umbrella, which was to avoid distractions and contamination. This one is a stretch, but Sanji has trained himself to avoid distractions, and his right eye is covered. But so Tamonten is symbolized by black and yellow like Sanji. But interestingly, opposed to the black turtle whose element is water, Tamonten's element seems to be earth, and Sanji himself is most depicted using fire. So let's follow that line of thinking. There was a particular god of fire that really stood out to me when comparing it to Sanji, and that was Kagutsuchi. Kagutsuchi was one of the last gods created by Izanagi and Izanami. Kagutsuchi's birth was so hot and fiery that Izanami was fatally burned during his birth and passed away because of Kagutsuchi. Enraged by his wife's death, Izanagi the father punished and killed Kagutsuchi in cutting him into 8 pieces, where all parts of him created new spirits and entities. Does this not sound like Sanji's childhood? Sanji was born and caused his mother's death, primarily because of his birth. Then later, because of his fiery passion to cook, his father was so enraged at his very existence that he actually pseudo-killed Sanji. Another interesting part in the lore was there were 2 counters made to quell but not subdue Kagutsuchi, one of them being Mizahanome, a goddess of water and irrigation, and was supposedly birthed by Izanami before she passed away and was taught how to pacify Kagutsuchi had he become uncontrollable. In another version, Kagutsushi's wife was a person named Hanya Subume, which means lady kneading clay, and she was associated with soil and plant growth. I really like both, and I can really see how this may connect back in the future in One Piece. Even Tamonten was associated with earth, but in this Japanese mythology, the wife of the entity was related to water and earth and plant growth. If you watch my elemental Haki video, then you know I alluded to the possible future earthbenders, and some of you even connected that the giants, the primary race left, would make a lot of sense to be the earthbenders. I wonder if there's a giant that fulfills these requirements and is the final love interest for Sanji. I think overall we will be looking out for a person that's represented by snakes, with an affinity for nature, water, and maybe gardening. But going back to Kagutsuchi, another interesting connection was that he was the god of destructive fire, volcanoes, but ended up being recognized for his ability to create and destroy, and was revered by blacksmiths and ceramic workers. Similarly to Hephaestus or Vulcan, who are the related gods in power in Greece and Rome, respectively. Though Kagutsuchi was not a smith himself, the aspect of fire and creation was the overall similarity. I think it also makes sense because though destructive, volcanoes are what create land, and eventually some of the most fertile land. On this topic though, I do want to return to the topic of creation, but before that, I want to briefly run through another godly connection that I'm still developing, and I will probably elaborate more in a future video that might be timed closely to my eventual Luffy video. But so we keep talking about the sun, and even Oda, if you pair the SBS quotes from before, Oda kind of alludes to the idea that Sanji harnesses the power of the sun, moon, and earth. When you think of the elements here on earth, it's all due to the combination of the three entities, but mainly the sun is the primary power source, and for a lot of reasons, I think Sanji actually might represent the sun in a lot of ways, and the funniest reason I'll save for last. But so that got me thinking, what if the monster trio represented Amaterasu, Tsukiyomi, and Susanoo? These three gods were born when Izanagi, the god we talked about earlier, washed his face, Amaterasu being the sun goddess, Tsukiyomi being the brother moon god, and Susanoo being the god of storms. Tsukiyomi feels like it'd have to be Zoro, especially if he is Shimotsuki or a Wano descendant. Any of the main clans have moon in their name, and we constantly talk about Zoro is representative of manipulating flow and energy, which is what the moon does. Also, Tsukiyomi was born from the right eye of Izanagi, and Sora has his right eye open. And before I get to Sanji, just quickly, Luffy in this case would be Susanoo, because Susanoo is also considered ruler of the sea, and Luffy wants to be the pirate king, and the god of storms relates back to so many things in regards to Luffy. But then Amaterasu, who is born from the right eye, which is what Sanji currently shows, and represents the goddess of the sun. So again, like I said before, I'm still exploring this connection, but an interesting detail that I thought of was, in some beliefs, Amaterasu is heavily associated to snakes, tying snakes to the sun, and that the initial gender of the goddess was male. The overall association with Amaterasu was that she supported women, and some people believe that because of her influence is why early rulers in Japan were female, which connects back to Sanji really well. But like I said, I'll expand on that later. Something I want to return to is the idea of creation and fire. So far, we've only seen Sanji's fire used for destructive purposes, but also cooking. Fire in mythology is multi-purposed actually. And Kagutsuchi's flame is seen as a tool for creation. In Naruto, we've seen the other color flames like Amaterasu being black that can't be put out. Even in One Piece, Ace showed us green flames before, and we've seen that Marco's blue flames can be used defensively, but also primarily for healing. Because of Sanji's control in his passions, his utmost generosity, and his already displayed control of fire, I wonder if we'll see other color flames for Sanji that also have other effects rather than just damage. The idea kind of being similar to another god, Raijin, the god of thunder, whose lightning could destroy, but also, apparently if his lightning struck a crop, it would produce a bountiful yield. Sanji uses fire for cooking, which technically is healing people, but I was thinking more along the lines that Sanji could use his fires to affect others in specific ways that he desired. Instead of straight damaging people, maybe he could spill his emotions onto others or affect others. Maybe he gets a blue flame that can make people cry or heal them like Marco's fire. It was already said that Sanji's cooking has hypnotic-like potency. Maybe Sanji gets hypnotic-like abilities like Miss Golden Week. It seems like Sanji has already gotten white flames which burn hotter. Won't be too sure until it's animated, but considering the theme of black in Sanji, I wonder if we'll see a black flame from Sanji that has some sort of other ability. But alright, maybe this sounds dumb to you. Like healing flame? Sanji? Really? Why would his attacks ever heal someone? The interesting part is that we've already seen Sanji brutally kick someone, and instead of damaging them, he has healed them. That sounds so cap, like ParVision is definitely lying right now, but nah, Sanji pulled out the SpongeBob move twice, where he kicked Wanze and Duval so hard that it rearranged their face and made them beautiful. He turns Wanze from this to this, and Duval from his doppelganger to Mr. Handsome, all with this kind of kick. One of them was actually called Plastic Surgery Kick, and we can tell that Sanji did this on purpose, like it was his will to change their faces. In Wanze's case, he can also undo it. I think this shows not just an ability to imbue willpower, but also an ability to potentially heal people. I think this also connects back to the idea that Sanji is the sun, as the sun is the source of life and energy. At this point, you're probably like, ParVision, bro, why do you keep bringing up the sun with Sanji, especially if Luffy is supposed to be the dawn or rising sun, or possibly the sun god? And this is where the funny connection where we go full circle from the start of the video. Remember how Oda had to change Sanji's name from Naruto to Sanji, and I said Naruto was probably significant for many reasons, but I also think that Sanji wasn't just a random name that worked. There was definitely meaning in the name. I'll talk about this one in the Vin Smoke video, so I'll just toss it out at first, but pretty sure Vin Smoke translates to smoked wine, where Vin is French for wine. The process of how that is done is actually interesting and relates to Sanji's most recent move, Ifrit. But moving to Sanji's name, I want to preface I'm not a Japanese speaker and I'll try to improve in the future, so the most apparent connection is San and Ji, representing the numbers 3 and 2. Sanji can also mean 3 o'clock snack, which is funny since Sanji is a cook, and I think he always makes snacks for people, but also we know that Oda likes using fun wordplay and number puns. Sanji, the numbers 3 and 2 could add up to be 5, which is the number Oda associates with him, probably also since he is the 5th member of the crew. Sanji is also the 3rd brother in his family, and Sanji could be translated as 3rd son. Another way it could be taken is if we take what G means from Awaji Island that we talked about earlier. G meant road or path to, and so Sanji could be the 3rd path or road. To be honest, when I looked up the 3 paths and how it could relate, it was actually kind of scary how relatable it was to the monster trio. So now I think I'm just going to make another video to explore that idea. But as a teaser, one of the 3 paths concepts in Japan referred to as Sanzu. The 3 paths under this ideology refer to the path of blood, the path of swords, and the path of fire. I don't know about you, but that sounds like a connection to me. All of the different interpretations of the 3 paths has a specific path that really sounds like Zoro at the minimum and relates to severing things. So yeah. But going back to the Sanji name thing, there was one other interpretation of Sanji's name that I thought was really funny, and I could definitely see this being the core interpretation for Sanji, especially after having to change it from Naruto, and in line with his SBS responses, is that G is just the word the, and San is the Japanese pronunciation of the word sun. So like if you were to say sun with a Japanese accent, it'd end up sounding like Sasanu. And so if you tie that to Sanji, then his name would be the sun, which again, Oda kind of blatantly said in that SBS where he says that the circles of the sun, earth, and moon is the kind of energy that Sanji's eyebrows harness, and that the swirls on the devil fruits connect to Sanji. But if you think Sanji's name means the sun, it makes sense why throughout this video there were so many connections to the sun and energy. And when you think about the swirl pattern in general, the swirls we see from hurricanes, cyclones, and the Naruto whirlpools are empowered by energy from the sun. But without the counterbalance of the moon, the powers could become overwhelming. And I think this is where we might get an understanding of what is going on with Sanji's eyebrows. We know they are significant because while Sanji's eyebrows were always flipped from the rest of his siblings, but more than that, it seemed like Sanji's genetic modifications were fully realized. His right eyebrow flipped to match his siblings. But if the Naruto whirlpool connection is meaningful, that might mean that Sanji's eyebrows are going to be in the opposite direction for one thing, but also it might revert back to normal. And we actually see that in the latest chapter 1036. But also, Reiju said something really interesting. She said the medicine that Sora took didn't necessarily negate the genetic modifications that Sanji was exposed to. Instead, she said the word halted. The effect of whatever Sora took ended up flipping the spiral on Sanji, or in other words, it altered his wavelength. So if we were to equate that to the sun-moon analogy, then Judge tried to incorporate the powers of the sun or fire to give his children energy. He took away their pain and emotion so that they could tolerate the change, and to counter it, Sora might have tried to incorporate powers of the moon, which manipulates the flow and alters waves and the energy of the sun. The moon creates flow, which we talked about with tears and emotions, that if you could harness the power of emotions, you could achieve incredible powers. And then Earth is representative of each user's body, most likely. And so this might give us a way to extrapolate what the drug's nature was. I think there are a few candidates, but maybe we haven't seen or learned about it yet. But if we have, I thought maybe Manshuri's tears maybe, but what really hit me was the idea of altering wavelengths. The effect of whatever she took altered the wavelength of his eyebrows literally, and we actually know of one drug that was noted to alter the wavelength of devil fruits, making it easier for the user to access power, and that was the Rumble Ball. So at this point, I realize I've stuffed multiple mini theories into a giant theory, each separate but connected, meaning some may be true and some may not be, but I just want to explore the idea of the Rumble Ball being the drug that Sora took. Well, for one, we know that the Rumble Ball affects wavelengths of devil fruits, which Oda himself has said connects back to Sanji. But for Chopper, the Rumble Balls were kind of training wheels for his powers, as we see that later on he's able to do many of the things he did pre-time skip in the post-time skip, but without the Rumble Ball. It also can be altered to make his monster form more tolerable and extend the time he has in it, and this upgrade was implemented by Caesar. The interesting thing about the Rumble Ball is that Chopper developed it as he was learning medicine, and learning from who? The mysterious genius Dr. Kureha. I want to make a video on her because I feel like all of her panels hold so many clues. For example, another One Piece viewer discovered that Dr. Hiruluke foreshadowed all the colors of Haki when talking to Chopper about pirates. But Dr. Kureha was probably the inspiration and original source for the concept of the Rumble Ball, and Chopper ran with it. Dr. Kureha might have done research on it before, and she apparently had the capacity to extend Dr. Hiruluke's life from 4 days to 2 weeks, where she said it was achievable by tricking his body, which is interesting for a different reason that some of you might know of. It might be possible that Dr. Kureha was the creator of Sora's genetic surgery counter. It's an idea that I'm exploring, but I will definitely be making a video on both Dr. Kureha and Dr. Hiruluke in the future. Another idea is that if the Germa Kingdom is supposed to represent Nazi Germany, then maybe the genetic surgery removed most of the lineage factors, only preserving the original code, which would have been the idea purported by white supremacy and master race theory, and in One Piece that race might have been tied to the sun, and may have something to do with the giants since they have the Winter Solstice Festival, which is held to celebrate the death and rebirth of the sun, whereas Sora might have countered it by incorporating more lineage factors, and in my previous videos I tied so many things to not just Wano but the moon, the minks, the swordsmen, fishmen, and various winged races, which would explain why Sanji is able to imitate powers from every race and also be so empathetic and knowledgeable. Knowledgeable because he might carry the generational trauma in his DNA from all the races. Like I said before though, we'll definitely know more once we find out what drugs Sora actually took, and that'll definitely change how we see Sanji. But now we are nearing the end of this video, and crazy enough, I still have so much more on Sanji that didn't fit into the flow of this video, and after I make some announcements, I will add some of the disconnected but connected ideas that I had about Sanji. I'm actually thinking I'll call that section the disconnected connection section, because they are connections but less connected to the rest of the discussion, and I think my current estimate, there's like 4 more videos related to Sanji that talk about so many cool things, but like always, I have to figure out the lineup. So let me summarize some of the power potentials I think Sanji will be able to get. Sanji seems to already be able to access invisibility, which is a concept I already thought was naturally attainable and talked about in the Usopp video. I later tied that ability to observation Haki, and considering Sanji will be the peak observation Haki user on the crew, I believe the other abilities that we see in my observation Haki video are all abilities Sanji can probably get or demonstrate, telepathy being an important one, but also instant teleportation. Because I consider Sanji the one with the strongest emotions, which according to the French philosopher René Descartes is what stirs and moves your soul to create action, then I think Sanji will also be an example of the highest tier of all Haki, including Conquerors, because Haki is essentially moving your soul to your will, which parallels the emotion concept in that more emotions means more powerful soul control. Conquerors make sense for so many reasons I explained in this video, but I'll go in more details in my Vinsmoke and Brook video, emphasizing that I don't think all Conquerors will manifest their overwhelming will in the same way, but essentially Sanji has already demonstrated the ability to affect other spirits and also imbuing his spirit into his actions and creations. It also seems like Sanji is demonstrating Conquerors in the latest chapter also. I think an extension of Sanji's cooking is that he's able to take ingredients and create masterful creations. He has demonstrated that he is able to augment and alter other people through his attacks. I thought that was interesting because of the parallel to Judge's initiative to artificially create humans. I think Sanji might be able to do the same thing, but rather by altering their souls. And like he's able to create perfect dishes, he will be able to adjust people physically and mentally and create ultimate versions of people if he chooses to. I think this is something that's also been demonstrated in the show, and in line with this might be a stretch, but Sanji might be able to fight with his hands and with weapons if he's able to learn how to attack without damaging people. But technically, like I said before, his cooking is already an asset that demonstrates this. Oh my god, there's a power I want to tie to Sanji so badly in this video, but it goes on a decent tangent, and I've been skillfully dodging it in my videos for a while now, so I'll save that for another video. But the teaser is basically soul cleansing is already an established power in One Piece. But moving on, I think Sanji will be able to convert his energy into all elements, and his primary one will be fire. We may see that Sanji is also able to create versatile sets of fire. He will also be a character that has no limitations on land, sea, or air. We may even see him traverse deadly climates like magma in a volcano. And I've already talked about this concept of natural energy in One Piece, closely resembling Sage Mode in Naruto, and I think Sanji, in line with energy conversion, can convert nature energy into Haki. And this concept I'll also dive deeper into, but centered around Zoro instead. And the most important thing to mention is that I think Sanji's most powerful power is probably memory, and that extends to all aspects of his power output. I'm thinking the way this will show up is that whenever Sanji experiences anything, he will immediately be able to copy it, and there should technically be no limitations to that power, and since if all powers derive from the sun, then it should be accessible to Sanji. It's just a mental limiter at that point. This is something I noted before that we've seen, but I think the way that it'll manifest is that Sanji's body will learn and adapt to every stimulus, meaning to properly fight Sanji, you need to switch attacks and constantly use new attacks, which would make it difficult for anyone really to win against him. This would make Sanji an incredibly durable shield, which is often the role we see Sanji take in protecting those around him. Sanji tried to block Enel's attack, and he always throws himself in front of women no matter what they're facing. Combining Sanji's elevated learning ability, Sanji would be kind of unstoppable with this. If Sanji willed it, he could probably recreate any attack he experienced and withstand weaker attacks than what his body remembers. Also, like I said before, this memory ability is probably what allows for Sanji's absurd level of physical restoration that we saw in Wano. I think, therefore I am, comes back to play here. Sanji kind of ignores the damage and says, I don't know, it hurts, but I can still move fine, and then proceeds to bring his body back together. I think that wearing the raid suit is probably something that instilled a bunch of memories into Sanji's body, which is what will probably allow him to access all the powers even without the raid suit. And then the next step is if Sanji is part Lunarian at all, possibly due to Sora's intervention, then Sanji may also be a master of energy conversion, which is something we see with King, where he takes kinetic energy and turns it into fire, magma, and explosions. King has a high tolerance for pain, which makes it allowable for him to use this power. Sanji, for so many reasons, has a high tolerance to pain, but also due to the possible memory armor he has, he may have the recovery to put him over King. So again, as a shield, this is incredible. But like the other character videos, let's talk about some of the epithets that Sanji may get by the end of the series. The first one I think will be Sanji, the King of Hearts, or the Conqueror of Passion, because of his massive control of his emotions and attention to others. I think like Zoro and Luffy and the rest of the crew, Sanji is deserving of a kingly title. The other title he might get that's kingly would contrast Zoro's recent King of Hell title, so King of Heaven could make sense for Sanji, but I personally like King of Hearts. Another title, Sanji the Dark Knight, tying in the Black Tortoise Beast and Black Warrior concept. There was too many connections there, but I think the wording of Black Warrior might be a little outdated, so the Dark Knight, as he has stealth and armor, it makes a lot of sense. I think in contrast to the Dark Knight, there needs to be something related to the sun or solar energy, so the Sun Warrior or Solar Shield. Also, this kind of goes without saying, but the greatest chef in the world, but maybe a variation to this title would be the Chef of Life, because he can infuse vitality into his creations. Another title, the Defender of Women. This one is pretty clear, but in the last part of the video, I'll elaborate a little more on why this is significant, and I'm already expecting a bunch of responses about how Sanji being a simp makes him weaker, so there's definitely going to be an extension to this video addressing all of that. The next title would be The Natural Man and the Warmest Soul. I think this one is important because I think human nature is always vilified in One Piece, specifically by fishmen, for example. The root of most evil in One Piece is from humans, but Sanji, who is ironically a man immersed in all of the emotions and passions that cause people to grow out of control, but instead he controls them. Not without difficulty either. He is willing to sacrifice his life for others, despite being an emotional person with dreams and aspirations, all because of how strong he stands with his morals and principles. He is a man that was supposed to be born with a heart of ice, but instead lets it burn as hot as the sun. If humans in One Piece acted like Sanji, the world would not be without flaw, but would definitely be a better place. Another reason why I think this name fits is because Sanji being represented by the sun that can manipulate all of nature, it would be fitting that a genetically modified human ironically ends up being the most natural human, which is technically what Judge was aiming for, but failed at and considered Sanji a failure, when he actually was probably the real success in the family. Some other titles would be Humankind's Vault, a little bit of a play on words, The Empathy Man, Humanity's Hero. Honestly, there's so many appropriate titles. At this point, these are just describing some of the end of series qualities he might embody, but I can definitely see some of these things fitting. Okay, so that's most of the video. I covered maybe like 60% of what I wanted to cover. Writing this script was honestly a lot of fun, and I ended up learning so much. By the time I first stopped writing, I realized the video was already well past the 30-minute mark. That being said, if you guys liked this video and wanted more in-depth ParVision content, please consider supporting me. I'm going to be working really hard on getting out crazier content on so many topics. After this video, I have so many videos in queue, but I also do want to make Arcane and Marvel videos. But I didn't want to delay this Sanji video for obvious reasons, so that being said, if you want to support me and help me make more in-depth content like this, subscribe as a Patreon or consider buying some of my merch or just share my content as much as possible. I really appreciate it. I'm going to be looking for ways to lighten the load on myself while still expanding my content output. Unlike these videos, the ParVisions literally never stop for me. Watching a movie, ParVision. Reading the news, ParVision. At a company meeting, ParVision. Doctor's office, ParVision. The place I usually get the most ParVisions though is actually the shower. So now starting the disconnected, connected sections of this video. The first disconnected connection I want to highlight for Sanji is that Sanji's name represents the number 3 and 2. So naturally Oda made his birthday 3/2 or March 2nd. And so since the number that we see for Sanji in One Piece in general is 3, I was thinking that's weird that he didn't make Sanji's birthday March 3rd or 3/3. And so just for fun, I was like, is there a significant holiday on March 2nd or March 3rd? And there is. March 3rd is called Doll's Day in Japan, but I think it's more modernly called Girls' Day, which is so fitting for Sanji. The day celebrates the good health and happiness of girls everywhere, and the dolls on display will protect children and girls and keep them safe. Then I noticed something interesting. The word for dolls is hina, and the word for fire in Japanese is hi. And I know this sounds kind of goofy, but when I saw that, I imagined that Sanji takes over Germa 66, and instead of making man clones, he makes women clones. And if the power behind humans is fire or the sun, then technically these clones would be fire clones or fire dolls. And Sanji would 100% have these fire dolls go and protect women worldwide. Like if Sanji were the new lead of Germa 66, that's definitely what he would do. But in general, I wonder if this connects back to another reason why Sanji is a huge defender of women. In the extended part or my Vince Smoke video, I will definitely explore in more detail Sanji's relationship to women and why it is the way it is. But going on to the second disconnected connection, I talked about a few times the possibility that Sanji gets and uses a weapon. If there's some loophole where he cooks his opponents that might allow him to use his hands and tools, this concept actually connects back to the Naruto whirlpools and the island of Awaji. That means the path towards the light. And also for the whirlpools to appear, they need a primary current, which would be the path of energy. And when thinking of weapons, I was thinking swords would allow Sanji to channel the power, and the thought that came to mind was actually the path of harmony, which is the Wado Ichimonji. This name makes a lot of sense since Sanji has to find harmony in his emotions and decisions to wield and control his powers. The balance of destruction and creation and love and hatred is in Sanji's hand, and that could be what the Wado Ichimonji is for. I know it's probably not likely that Sanji wields the Wado Ichimonji and maybe a different sword appears, but then I remembered that in the Shokugeki no Sanji actually used the Wado Ichimonji. Obviously this wasn't created by Oda, but maybe that was a detail that Oda helped guide them in creating the story. Also considering in the story, it's weird that Zoro would give his most personal sword, the Wado Ichimonji, rather than a different one. This idea is definitely more of a stretch, but it was just an interesting connection that I ended up finding. And then the thought of Zoro actually giving his sword to Sanji would be crazy in the story, in my opinion at least. So now a third disconnected connection. So something that I thought about was maybe the concept of raid suits was based off of a mythical armor in the real world. So I looked through a few lists, and this is the one that sounded closest to it, but I did stumble on some other interesting ones. Like if Sanji ever gets earrings, I might talk about a different armor, but for this video, I stumbled upon, apologies for the pronunciation, the Babir-e-Bayan. This armor was said to be invulnerable against fire, water, and weapons, which is what we see of the raid suit, and specifically the things that Perospero noted. The one thing that was weird was this armor was dark and hairy, and so I looked at what it meant, and it said that in some texts it's said to be made out of leopard skin. skin. So then I was thinking like, well, Rob Lucci is a leopard, but then I googled Sanji and leopard skin, and I randomly found this image of Sanji with a leopard cape and just laughed. Of course, there'd somehow be a connection there, but again, nothing concrete, just an interesting detail I found. But anyways, I'll end this video with a more interesting disconnected connection. I think there might be reason to believe that Sanji might get the same power as Smoker. I always thought it was interesting about how much emphasis Sanji's cigarette gets. It's definitely unhealthy, so don't smoke, guys. But now we know his body auto-heals anyways, which your bodies don't do, by the way. But even more so, isn't it kind of true that Sanji probably doesn't even need the lighter to start his cigarette now? I wonder if the cigarette is an indicator of Sanji's power, or gives Sanji power in some other kind of way. Kind of like Charmander's tail? But if Sanji has a memory body, and from cooking and smoking, besides fire, smoke is probably the other quote substance he's probably familiar with. I wouldn't be surprised if he has some smoke-like abilities, which would mean abilities that cause illusions. One connection I mentioned before is the last name Vinsmoke, which means smoked wine, and the way that is done is using a fumararium, which is basically a smoke chamber. But another connection is Sanji recently used the move Ifrit, and Ifrit is a reference to an Islamic being that was said to control fire and have bodies made out of smoke. In any case, I have so many more videos and connections on the way. There's so much more I want to talk about with Sanji and One Piece and everything. This is still the tip of the iceberg. So in part 3 of my Sanji video, I say that Sanji will eventually get the power to heal, or even further augment and improve living things. This idea stems off the preliminary concept that Sanji has been imbuing his will into his cooking, and through his cooking we have been able to see an insane revitalization ability. He is able to literally make people change their personalities or get hypnotized, as Bedge claims, and feel extreme bliss and happiness like Big Mom proclaims. This is a Conqueror-like ability, and all this contrasts what Judge tried to force through unnatural means. Judge created his kids to be conquerors and was augmenting humans to be superior, but ultimately deemed Sanji to be a failure, when the ultimate reverse Uno card will be that Sanji will be the only true conqueror among the Vinsmokes, and Sanji will also be able to augment humans to actually be the superior versions of themselves through his immense understanding of emotions, the exact thing that Judge deemed unnecessary for evolution. And the best part is that we've already seen Sanji be able to kick people into better versions of themselves, as we've seen with Duval and Wanze. Watch the part 3 of the Sanji video to get an elaboration on that. And on top of all of this, the power to change someone's soul and also affect someone's spirit through food are both powers that are already established in One Piece. And if you've seen my Devil Fruit videos and also the Devil Seed user videos, I firmly believe that Devil Fruits are primarily knowledge that is passed on and were originally created through some sort of peak Haki ability. So as I explained in my Sanji video again, I also think that Sanji might be able to affect others' emotions through his attacks and cooking, similar to Miss Golden Week's painting ability, but Miss Golden Week's power is more or less temporary. The way I'm thinking of Sanji augmenting people is more permanent and drastic, like Ivankov's ability to change someone's biological gender through hormones. I think Sanji might be able to augment people like this. Could you imagine if Sanji were able to change his opponent's gender? There'd be a lot more compassion, that's for sure. But let's take that a step further. One of Sanji's limitations right now is he can't fight women no matter what. What if he could change the women into men and then beat them and then they change back later on? Again, that's a power that's already established in One Piece, and it would be insane if Sanji would be able to augment people like this. But okay, that doesn't sound too right. Would he be able to mimic the hormone fruit? I'm not too sure. And he'd still be hitting a woman just in a man's body, so there is gray area with that context. And then I realized, wait, Sanji has no problems with women fighting women. So what if instead Sanji temporarily changes himself into a woman? And I thought that was crazy, and then I remembered the anime-only scene of Sanji during the time skip, where they actually converted Sanji into a maiden, and he looked like this. We normally think the only thing that Sanji retained from the time skip was the attack cuisine, but he also to some degree probably got more comfortable with his apparent true self, which according to Caroline was the heart of a maiden. But okay, that was more of a mental conversion, not a full body transformation, and I don't think Ivankov ever used his ability on Sanji. And then I realized post-time skip, Sanji got turned into a woman, specifically Nami. And remember what I said in my full Sanji video? Sanji might have the ability to mimic or copy anything he experiences or remembers. So this could be another loophole possible for Sanji to fight women as a woman himself. Obviously there's still Zeph's commandment in place, but his commandment said a man can't hit a woman, and there is an ability to change Sanji and his opponent. So it's just an interesting thought since technically this does exist inside the One Piece world. But I'm also more than fine with Sanji relying on the power of women around him to help him in his time of need. That gives One Piece more than enough room to highlight women's strength, unlike some other unnamed animes. If you know, you know. But okay, this wasn't even what I wanted to talk about in this video. While I think that this power would fit Sanji pretty well, I think it's time to go to something a little bit more grounded. As I mentioned in part 2 of the Sanji video, Sanji has shown the ability to hypnotize, but moreover make people better versions of themselves, specifically a more honorable and moral person. We see this many times with Sanji, but the most apparent example that I brought up was with Jin, who was considered a man demon who had no mercy and brutally killed people despite their screams for salvation. Sanji's cooking seemed to be the primary catalyst towards instilling what seems to be a drastic change, so much so that Jin's captain was absolutely stunned that a man so loyal to him could change so quickly. It seems like Sanji's cooking cleansed Jin's soul a little bit, with Sanji's generosity and kindness also. That being said, this power to clean a person's soul exists, and we have seen it and Oda has clarified it. Most people probably thought that this fruit was dumb, and some asked me about how this fruit connects back to my theories, and I'll elaborate on that in a future video. But the fruit that I want to talk about is the Washu Washu no Mi that Vice Admiral Suru has, making her the laundry human. This power sounds goofy, but Oda elaborated on it in an SBS on page 568, where he says she can wash anything, and villains who have been dried get their hearts a little bit cleaner as well. They say that their evil hearts become fainter, so that's a dangerous ability against pirates. Which is also why it seems like Doflamingo is cooperative with Suru in their interactions and calls her Osuru, which is respectful and almost seems scared. This makes sense because if Suru used her powers on Doflamingo, she could make him slightly better person, but it's noted that it's an incremental change. So for Doflamingo, I'd imagine he need to be washed a few hundred times. Maybe that's how we get a reversal in Doflamingo's character. But this makes you wonder why Suru just doesn't wash all the prisoners. Seems like that would be the best way to reform evil in One Piece. Technically, her washing wouldn't really work on the Straw Hats though, because they aren't evil. But so anyways, this power exists in One Piece, and I think Sanji might be able to naturally display this. Either through his cooking or attacks, he might be able to clean people's soul like Suru does. Like I said before, we already saw this demonstrated on Jin, but then tying into the fact that Sanji has already physically modified people and the Vinsmoke legacy is human modification, it makes sense if Sanji's power eventually extended out this far. There are other examples that I think of in terms of glow-ups. You know how the celestial dragons are hideous, and I think that's supposed to represent their twisted nature. But then we see Doflamingo's uncle. I'm not going to act like I can pronounce that name. Someone in the comments give me the pronunciation, please. But he got relatively better looking once he became a more sensible human being, despite being a celestial dragon. I think Sanji can force that kind of change out of anyone, which as Oda noted would be an extremely dangerous power against evil and pirates, which again is why I'm saying that Sanji's power might be insane by the end of the series. Another one that I briefly want to mention, because I do think opponents in One Piece are important indicators for characters, but Sanji also fought another person who could clean you, and not just clean you, but clean your strength away. Khalifa, the CP9 member who ate the Awa Awa fruit, or the Bubble Bubble fruit. An asterisk here, because this translation of Awa could be what the Awaji connection in my larger Sanji video meant, but given Sanji has experienced this would also be a great power to incorporate for Sanji because it could disable people without actually fighting. These powers aren't outright increases in strength, but that's what I was saying about Sanji, is that his power can still be equally powerful through ways that aren't just purely brute force like his kicks or Zoro, or the rest of the Vinsmoke family, which honestly makes a lot of sense as the Straw Hats cook. And speaking about cooking, the whole imbuing food with Haki and changing or even commanding people's will is again an already established thing in One Piece. In terms of food devil fruits, there's Strawson's ability to turn anything into food, but I don't think Sanji would do this. Can Sanji's food change or hypnotize people? Yeah, I think so. And is there a devil fruit that demonstrates the ability to make food to then hypnotize people? There is the kibi dango fruit that Tama ate. She is literally feeding all the animals her cheek dumplings, and then animals including smile users are then tamed by her. Because this is present already, could it be that Sanji ends up gaining this ability or the version of this that works on people? The way I can imagine this is the Straw Hats detain a prisoner and Zoro is the bad cop, Luffy is the goofy cop, Nami would be the scary cop, and Sanji would be the good cop. He'd give you a meal and that meal would make you sing. It would make you want to divulge everything. But there's also a practical fighting function for this too, as he could just alter enemy mindsets, or maybe it could command animals. Not sure how it would pan out, to be honest. So to summarize and cap off the ideas presented in my Sanji video, I think Sanji might get a transformative power like this, and it will further make Judge the perfect polar opposite, as Sanji will become a conqueror who can make people the ultimate evolutions of themselves, all while embracing and encouraging emotions. This is also an interesting concept because as a cook, Sanji is making dishes, and throughout One Piece we have seen Sanji using cooking techniques and using his culinary skills during fights. In the Briat Savaron book, Physiology of Taste, that I mentioned in the Sanji video, it states that the core of cooking is fire, and the third form of cooking is basically pharmaceutical or medicinal, and we see Sanji fighting with fire and grilling and essentially cooking his opponents. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see Sanji turn people into perfect dishes at the biological level also. I have many more Sanji extension videos coming up. I would really appreciate it if you guys shared the full video with your friends and One Piece groups. I have way more in queue, so stay strapped in guys, the ride is only starting. I think the next Sanji extension video will be related to Sanji's families. As always, thank you for connecting with me, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you all on the next ParVision.